So I'm very pleased to introduce Komp, the Deputy Director for California NORML. She's been a marijuana activist since 1991. She's very much an industry OG. We're so happy to have Ellen here today. She was a volunteer petitioner for Prop 215 back in 1995. She served on the San Luis Obispo County Drug and Alcohol Advisory Board in 97 and 98, served as a program associate for what is now the DPA, has assisted attorneys in medical marijuana defenses, and was named High Times Freedom Fighter of the Month. She's also founded the website very important potheads.com back in 2001, and she writes about famous females and cannabis, and is the author of the book Token Women, a 4,000-year Hirsh story. Welcome, Ellen. We also are joined by Lynne Lyman, justice consultant and Prop 64 co-author. Lynne's contributions to this industry are also immense. She's an advocate and a policy expert working to reduce mass incarceration and end racial discrimination in the industry. Most recently, Lynne served as a policy and strategy consultant to reform LA jails and Measure R and LA County ballot measure to reduce the jail population and enact real oversight of the LA sheriff, which secured 72% of the vote in the March 2020 primary. Lynne was the California State Director for the DPA from 2012 to 2017. She's co-authoring and co-chairing the successful 2016 marijuana legalization initiative, Prop 64. Lynne co-founded LARRP, the Los Angeles Regional Reentry Partnership, in 2011, and continues to serve on its executive and steering committees today. Next, we're joined by Hirsh Jain, the Director of Government Affairs at Caliva, one of the largest vertically integrated cannabis companies in California. Hirsh was previously the West Coast Director of Government Affairs at MedMen, the largest cannabis retailer in the country, overseeing the company's work in California, Arizona, and Nevada. Before working in cannabis, Hirsh was a government affairs manager at Airbnb in San Francisco, helping build the company's global policy team up from 30 to 300 people. Welcome, Hirsh. And finally, this conversation today will be moderated by Conrad Gregory, SVP of Harborside Incorporated, where he leads the government relations and compliance activities of Harborside Inc., one of the oldest and most respected cannabis brands in the US. His work covers the policy and politics of the cannabis industry, as well as the development of current and future licenses. Prior to joining Harborside, Gregory helped run several successful political campaigns at the local, state, and federal levels before moving to Sacramento to work for then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom as chief consultant for economic policy. Welcome, Conrad. And actually, finally, last but not least, around 11:30, we will be joined by California Treasurer Fiona Ma. Fiona was elected November 2018 as California's 34th treasurer with more than 7 million votes, more than any other candidate for treasurer in the state's history. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and Treasurer Ma is the state's primary banker and is the first woman of color to hold this position. She oversees more than $2 trillion of revenue running through the treasurer's office every year. She stated her overarching goal is to recognize the future and make sure it is distributed evenly. Most recently, before being elected treasurer, she was an elected member of the California Board of Equalization, where she worked to protect the rights of taxpayers. While on the Board of Equalization, she led efforts to regulate the cannabis industry, develop systems to track and trace all cannabis in California, and develop legal banking mechanisms for cannabis businesses. So we'll keep an eye out for Fiona. She should be here in about 15 minutes, but in the meantime, Conrad, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Aria. Hi, everyone. Thank you to that panel that came before. That was a lovely panel with our absolutely critical local regulators. Wow, that's really important for the state of California and how our system works. Hello to everyone. Meadowlands, day 2. Very excited to be joined here today with Komp, Lynne Lyman, and Hirsh Jain, and in a little while, Fiona Ma. I know we're running a little bit behind. I just want to kick it off really quickly. The title of the panel that we're discussing, the topics we're focusing on is essential cannabis in light of local and state budget shortfalls. I just want to talk about that first word first, essential. I don't think there is any way we can understate and repeat over and over this year that in 2020, cannabis was deemed essential. That is so critical, and it happened across the country. There was some hiccups in Massachusetts, I believe, but I just want our panelists to open up with what you felt about essential cannabis, what it meant to you, and how you see that playing out into the future. Because that was just a watershed moment for legalization and cannabis. I'd like to start with Ellen, if you want to kick it off. I think you're on mute, Ellen.
Okay, that's better, yes?
Yeah.
So yes, I participated in, as did many other groups, in that essential designation. We had some hiccups here in California too, in San Francisco, and then in San Jose, and then we had to lobby at the state level. Basically, the rationale was that people require it for medicine, and the medical and recreational markets have merged to such a degree now that in order to serve the medical population, we had to keep the recreational one open. And of course, liquor stores were essential because they're permitted to sell other items like bottled water and things that are essential items. And so that put us on that kind of parity. So yes, it was another moment, to mark the progress that we've made, that yes, we're essential. We saw some predictable backlash. There was even a church in Southern California that sued Governor Newsom because churches weren't essential while cannabis was. But that I don't think is going anywhere. So yes, it was wonderful to see and to take us to another level, and it really another level of hypocrisy too, but that hopefully can change in the near future at the federal and other levels.
Yeah, it really was a big moment. Thank you for that. And for those of you that don't know as well, I'm currently serving as the board president for California Cannabis Industry Association. We worked hard on the essential cannabis designation as well. That was not a given, to be really clear for everyone to understand. It took work and effort and time to make it happen. And Hirsh, if I go to you next, you and I spoke directly about San Jose and how that essential designation played out there for our respective companies. So Hirsh, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Ellen said it well. I'll just say that I think there's enormous rhetorical power in that term essential, and I think the industry has done a very effective job at leveraging that. And I'll also note that I think the pandemic revealed a number of things about our society, both good and bad. And one of the good things is that the mischaracterization of cannabis that exists was undermined, because when push comes to shove, this is something that is essential to people and has been for tens of thousands of years. And the last thing I'll just note is that even though cannabis was deemed essential at the statewide level, obviously we ran into some challenges in Santa Clara County. And I think that just illustrates there's a decentralized sort of governing structure here. Thankfully, we're ultimately able to have our stores open, but it just goes to show you that at the local level, that there's a lot of work to be done in addition to the state level.
Great, absolutely. And the work continues as always. Lynne, what do you think?
Let me just start by thanking Ellen and NORML and CCIA and so many of you who did the work to make this happen. And I think it goes to show that when the cannabis community and industry is united, anything can happen. And so hopefully we'll see more of those kinds of efforts. I was thrilled to see it designated as essential. I know it was certainly essential for me. And I think it's helped a lot of us survive this stay-at-home order. But I also want to point out, as someone mentioned, some of the ironies that were also revealed. Of course, being essential in California, but still illicit at the federal level meant that cannabis industry businesses were not able to get the kind of economic relief that other businesses were able to get. And I think the state could have done more. The state did more for other communities that were ineligible for federal aid, like the immigration and undocumented communities. And I think it should and could do more for cannabis industry, particularly if this pandemic extends. But I also think that it's really important in terms of what it did for local cities. I think local cities who are each facing their own economic crises realize that maybe their ban on commercial cannabis wasn't the best way to go. And so I think we are now seeing and will continue to see an increase at the local level for regulating cannabis in these jurisdictions because they need the money.
Yeah, fantastic. And, I couldn't have planned it better. That was a lovely segue. Thank you. So as part of the pandemic, right, cannabis was deemed essential, but the pandemic also caused a swift and deep recession that hit everywhere all at once, frankly, and we're still in the middle of it. No one knows when this is going to end. And I don't have the exact numbers, but I want to say the state of California currently is looking at something like a 50 billion with a B budget shortfall. I mean, that is crazy. And you take that number, that's just the state of California, and you imagine what's happening in each local jurisdiction, especially those that are reliant upon retail tax revenue, right? So that is really critical. I just want to go to Hirsh real quick in terms of the effect in terms of budget shortfall and thinking or rethinking bans in all those jurisdictions that might have wanted to prevent cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see this both in California and nationwide. I think, as many of us on this video know, there's only about 100 jurisdictions out of the 500 cities in California that allow for retail cannabis sales. What I think is very encouraging is that many of those other jurisdictions are now opening up, right, because of the desire for revenue. And I think the question then is, now that cities seem to have an increasing appetite for cannabis, how do we pass ordinances that enable broad participation in the market? Like, prohibition is not a binary, it's not an on or an off. Many cities pass ordinances that still limit licenses, that have huge licensing fees, that have property requirements, that have drawn out land use processes, that make it very hard for the average person who's not a millionaire to participate in the cannabis economy. So now that cities are thinking about opening up, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to develop ordinances that enable broad participation in the cannabis market. So,
yeah, absolutely. And it is the case that all kinds of jurisdictions across California, especially, are rethinking and looking at cannabis again as a possible source of tax revenue. I think it's worthwhile for everyone on this panel as a general talking point whenever you're speaking to anyone, especially those in government, that it is frankly foolish to think that you should balance your city or state budget on the back of cannabis. It's not a good idea. If we've seen anything, cannabis is unpredictable. So you will have a unpredictable stream of tax revenue. So with that, I just want to get Lynne, your take a little bit more on jurisdictions opening up and how they're trying to look at tax revenue from cannabis.
Yeah, so I think it's encouraging. There's at least 25 jurisdictions looking that have a tax measure on the ballot on November 3rd. And as everyone knows, a tax measure is the precursor to regulating. Most of those jurisdictions don't also have a regulatory ordinance on that measure, and so that work has to come afterwards. But one of the big concerns I have is that not one of these tax measures includes a set aside for a community reinvestment fund, which is what we did with Prop 64. In fact, there may not be any cities, if anybody knows of one, please put it in the chat, in the state at this time who have set aside funding for community reinvestment funds, not even the city of LA. Most cities, all of the money is going to the general fund. And as we know, when money goes to the general fund, that means it goes to the police. Between 33 and 55% of every single municipal budget in this state and in the country currently goes to law enforcement and policing. And so what's going to happen as all of these localities come on board, they are, we're doing the opposite of defund the police. We are going to be really boosting the police in all of these jurisdictions. And so I think that we need, the industry needs to be more focused on what's happening in each of these cities. And it's very difficult. And I think it's difficult for the industry and consumers to even keep track of the different regulations across jurisdictions. But I think it's concerning that there's just going to be this pipeline going to police in this particular moment. And it's ironic that it would be coming from the cannabis community that has historically been persecuted and oppressed by policing. I did want to add one piece about, about how to do this better, right? And I don't think we do this well enough in these localities, and how to really create a hospitable environment for businesses and communities in some of these cities. And what I would encourage the industry to do is to go, if you're not already in the city, you should be, but walk the streets of that city, meet the local shop owners, contact the local community-based organizations, the groups that serve youth and veterans and the elderly. You know, go to the PTA meeting, ask people what their concerns are, get to know the community, and, you know, maybe even commit to investing in some of their local causes. But right now, and I do spend some time in some of these cities that are considering regulating, and mainly what they have is a whole bunch of residents showing up saying, we don't want it, it's going to ruin everything. And then a few industry folks showing up saying, no, that's not true. And so what we're not doing is engaging in sort of a more robust dialogue around how to make this work for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's good to note and remember that government moves slowly, including their budget processes. And so, you know, when I imagine what might be happening in terms of these budget shortfalls at the local level, the first thing that will probably start to happen, even if they're considering cannabis revenue, is budget cuts. That'll probably be the first thing that actually starts to happen that we'll see right away. And in that world, when it comes to budget cuts, you do see cuts to police. Sometimes you see cuts to healthcare, you see cuts to education. Those are really kind of the larger buckets that tend to get hit. And I think there is a discussion that would be useful between cannabis and budgets and cities, which is about enforcement. It's about lowering barriers to entry for those folks that want to be in the legal cannabis industry. And it's, like you said, Lynn, creating this kind of hospitable environment where cannabis companies, which are just by their nature going to be unpredictable and in their baby infancies, right, trying to survive in this environment. You know, Ellen, if you wouldn't mind touching on that for a second.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad I'm last on this, because I agree with you, Conrad, that we can't really be balancing the budget on the backs of cannabis. I mean, that's a little absurd. Although, you know, the U.S. originally was pretty much funded by liquor taxes, and it was alcohol prohibition is ushered in income tax, because that, you know, that went away. But, you know, yes, $55 billion deficit we're expecting. We're a $3 billion industry. You know, do that math. However, at the local level, I am encouraged, you know, anything that encourages local licensing is great. I mean, we have seen, even as Prop 64 was on the ballot, we've seen a lot of local initiatives on each ballot. Just about everyone that has a tax in it passed. And yes, local officials use it as a referendum or a bellwether on if people want those kind of businesses. But honestly, I don't really see us becoming the kind of industry that can have the kind of impact at the state level that we might have until we have greater legalization. And by that, I mean places where people can consume it. A lot of people can't consume it in their own homes. Their landlords don't permit it. There aren't a lot of consumption rooms around the state. You know, if you compare it to liquor, look at all the bars and restaurants that, you know, even now during COVID, you can go to a restaurant, sit outside and order some liquor. The other thing is, and this was touched on at the end of the last panel, employment rights. You can still lose your job for using cannabis in California, even if you have a medical recommendation. And so much of our community is unemployed or underemployed, or is unable, you know, a lot of people in California are unable to use it at all because of their jobs. So California NORML has been working to try to change that for medical patients. And we're actually looking next time around at broadening that to all cannabis users, their employment rights. It's been done in Nevada, it's been done in New York City, and it's coming. And it was correct, Max, that I think I brought that up with you once. Arkansas is one of several other states that at least have some protections for medical patients. So, and even pain patients who use opioids are often kicked off of their prescription drugs if they're using cannabis, which is really the opposite of what should happen. We should be driving it in the other direction. And I do hope if we can get tax relief for this industry that and build it better, that we can see more tax relief and price release for people who need it for medicine. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good points you were making there. And I do try and keep in mind that when we speak about increasing access to cannabis as an essential medicine, I view it in a couple ways, right? So one is this idea that cities or locations or states that have banned cannabis need to open up, right? That increases access. But the other side of access is price, and trying to normalize the price and not have the price so significantly inflated by taxes also helps increase access. I just want to kind of stay a little bit on this point around budgets and what's going on in terms of local jurisdictions. Just like in the pandemic, we've seen the data play out that lower income communities and people of color have been, for whatever reason, significantly more harmed by the pandemic and actually killed. And it's really terrible. And I think in terms of the cannabis industry, you will see social equity operators and folks that, the smaller businesses get harmed more, sadly, as this all unfolds. And I just want to get your take and kind of how do we balance things out? How do we keep a pretty level playing field and allow for the cannabis industry to grow, especially an industry where, in my opinion, there's room for everybody. Lynn, you want to start out?
Sure. I think I'll tackle your question on sort of social equity first and those being most harmed. And I think, Conrad, we do know why people of color and poor people are being impacted by the pandemic the most. It's because they have less access to healthcare and other basic services. It's because they are our essential workers. They are in our grocery stores. They are our nurses and our medical assistants. And so they have the greatest amount of exposure. It's not some sort of predisposition, as I know some people think it is. But let's talk about the impact on the social equity community. I think, we have to be honest and just admit that there are very few social equity operators right now. Most of the social equity folks are still in an applicant phase or have perhaps won a license but have not had a chance to open. Many are still in their second or third year of holding a building, waiting for that license to come through. And so the impact has been tremendous on those communities. And I think there's a lot we could do pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic to make this work. So we focus a lot on just sort of the priority licensing part of social equity in cannabis, but we have to remember that's just one piece. We have got to start providing technical assistance and business assistance, fee deferrals. We heard Senator Bradford talk yesterday on a different panel about, at actually a different conference, but going on at the same time. I was moving back and forth, who I promise. But he was talking about the fact that he passed a fee deferral law last year, and yet folks are not receiving those fee deferrals in the jurisdictions. We need loans and startup funding. We need, again, going back to the community repair, because the harm from the war on drugs wasn't just done to individuals. And priority licensing for social equity applicants is a huge way to redress the harm done to individuals, but harm was done to communities. Entire communities were devastated throughout the war on drugs, and primarily those are Black and some Latino communities. And so we have got to get serious about community reinvestment. You're going to hear me say it again and again. This is different from corporate social responsibility. I know sometimes the two get conflated. Corporate social responsibility is what, established businesses should be doing to give back to their community. Community reinvestment is a way that governments can use tax revenue to redress harms of the past, to repair the harms of the war on drugs. And so we could do all the priority licensing in the world, but if we aren't doing repair in these communities, if we aren't getting people the business assistance and the loan assistance, we're going to end up, in 3 years where we are now, with very few actual social equity operators in this state.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lynn. That was wonderful. And actually a good segue. I'd like to welcome California Treasurer Fiona Ma to the panel. She has joined us. I don't quite see her yet. There she is. Hello, hello. And very excited to have you here. And, Fiona, what we're discussing is kind of this framework around the pandemic, the budget shortfalls that have hit, and kind of how it all intersects with cannabis and all the many, many issues that we're all grappling with. And I think what Lynne was just highlighting, this idea about community reinvestment, I recall banks being subject to the Community Reinvestment Act. That was a huge deal, and it required local lending, it required local participation. And I think as treasurer, you can speak a little bit to that community reinvestment piece, and in part as well, this idea that cannabis, although deemed essential, was unable to access, relief loans because of the inability to access banks. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So as many of you know, and I was reminded today that we met Meadow and Hua back in 2015 when I was on the State Board of Equalization, trying to understand and learn about the cannabis industry. And it became very apparent that we need to bank the industry, not only for the safety aspects, but the ease of doing business and of course, collecting taxes, which is my former position as the friendly tax collector on the State Board of Equalization. So I have been following this issue very closely. I got elected to state treasurer about 2 years ago now. And as the state's banker, working very closely with the banking industry and again, trying to push this issue. I testified on the Perlmutter bill back in I think it was February of 2019. I was on one of the panels, the first cannabis bill that's ever been heard before Congress. And it was very interesting because there were some members in Congress who were completely clueless to what is really happening out there in the cannabis industry and the great need, but also the economic generator that this industry supports. And so, as you said, this pandemic has really focused us in my office on creating real-time resource guides for individuals, small businesses, nonprofits, seniors, food access, and tax relief. And it's on my website, www.treasure.ca.gov. And we update it in a real-time basis because a lot of programs, they come online and everybody applies and the money is gone and you're sitting there waiting to see if someone's going to call you back or miraculously a check is going to appear, and sometimes they just don't and nobody tells you about that. But as we were watching the various stimulus packages, one of the unfairness of this whole pandemic, or fairness, I guess, right? Cannabis was deemed an essential service, which was great for the industry because we really needed the help, given that lack of banking access and, difficult licensing, high taxes in Prop 64. So that was the silver lining. But the other half was the industry was not eligible for any type of stimulus relief from the federal government because of the Schedule 1 nature. Now, the governor did allocate $500 million. So I think it's $100 million to the iBank to give out for small business loans. And we thought, great, well, it's money coming from the state. The state has legalized cannabis. Hopefully we can use some of this money for the cannabis industry. And we started down that path. I think we, found a bank that was willing to do it. And that was one of the prerequisites. And we did do one loan and then we were stopped from doing that program, probably, from the attorneys who were not really sure and all this, and they just didn't want to. So I thought we had a little sliver at that point. I still think the state, we could issue or be able to offer, grants and loans through various other programs. But unfortunately, it requires a lot of maybe creativity. The Attorney General needs to support it. But I do think that it is not fair what is happening, that the industry is not able to access any of the federal or state stimulus funds.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for that. I did not realize that even one loan actually went through to cannabis through that iBank program. I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out if loans to cannabis could happen. I assumed none. In some ways, it's almost even more sad that only one made it. But I think you touch upon some really important issues for the cannabis industry. And when I think about what access to capital means access to capital is so critical. Access to banking services is so critical. And it is a social equity issue. It's a public safety issue. It's a survival of the industry issue. And I'll say, and I'll attest for everyone here on the panel and listening, that the cannabis industry is probably one of the most creative industries in the world, period, bar none. And if you need any help to advocate or push or come up with an idea for how the state can do lending to cannabis companies, we are here to help. I'm just going to make that promise on behalf of everyone right now, because when companies look to raise money, first of all, if they look at raising debt, it tends to be really expensive. And, rates, 15%, fairly common for debt. And that is not really normal business lending. And so the state could be really helpful and provide a leg up to these businesses. I did have go ahead.
I just wanted to add that the House has been trying to pass the Safe Banking Act as part of their HEROES Act, as you probably have followed. They just passed on Thursday a third HEROES Act, which does include the Safe Banking Act, which I'm happy about. But the Senate controlled, Republican-controlled Senate does not like including the Safe Banking Act as part of any type of stimulus package. So I would encourage everyone to, write to your members of Congress, senators, let them know that this is important. It's going to be a great leveler, and we definitely need to see the Safe Banking Act pass as a minimum at this moment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it does need to happen, and we all appreciate the fact that safe banking has been incorporated in I think 2 of the last relief bills passed by the House. And speaking of relief, I do see a question coming up in the chats, which I think is another piece of it. Is, as we've seen this year, it is frankly one crisis on top of another, and they have been compounding. And for those of you that somehow have missed the news, California is just on fire. And, that has become the norm, sadly, at the end of each summer for the past few years. And we have lost farms, cannabis farms, businesses, and there's been evacuations. Significant impacts have occurred. And so real quickly, I would turn to the panel and just think about how you see these impacts happening, these compounding crises, and how the state could be helpful possibly. Hirsh, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I think, what has happened this past year and what has happened the past several years will bring further attention to just the environmental impact of cannabis cultivation and how that can be done much more sustainably. It's sort of like the impacts of climate change are being felt in the biggest cannabis market in the country, if not the world. And it'll be interesting to see what technologies develop in response to that. And it's also interesting to see which states are taking the lead on that. So for instance, I know that Massachusetts is really the national leader in ensuring that its cultivators follow environmental best practices. And I think the companies that are going to be successful are those that can demonstrate their responsibility on sustainability.
Great. Ellen?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's just these compounding crises that are unfolding, especially in California when you add in the wildfires. And so we've got evacuations, we have farms that have been lost, and what could or should the state be doing to help some of these businesses?
Yes, well, as has been pointed out, we're kind of left out of the loop on a lot of these relief packages. So anything that can be done to include us. Another thing is, farmers often can't get crop insurance, especially, I don't think any outdoor farmers can get crop insurance at this point. Wow. And some of that has to change because the insurance company is actually charging at least 5 times as much for, say, events and things for cannabis, but they're not really serving us in some of the ways that they need to be, and as far as I'm concerned. So there's a lot of levels where, just opening up, and, the federal elephant is always an issue, and we're working hard at NORML and elsewhere to break through that, because that's, of course, that's what's impeding banking and a lot of other things that could keep businesses, able to get loans and the sort of things that they need to rebuild.
Yeah, thank you. Lynne, what do you think?
I think there's three things that that the state can do, and localities perhaps. But the first thing is relief, and because the fire-related relief is state funding, there is no reason that cannabis cultivators and other companies should be excluded from it. And so I think they can and should get some relief from the state from the fires. The second thing is, this may be more difficult, but the regulations, I took a trip recently with my friend Jackpot, who's on a panel coming up. We took a trip up to Humboldt right as the fires were starting. We were sort of just, 2 days ahead of the fires. And we visited with farmers up there. And I have to say, it was heartbreaking. It was a heartbreaking trip. And this is before the fires had hit, to sit with the farmers, the outdoor sun-grown farmers, many of them women-led farms, and just listen to the level of challenges they were having, so much of it from local regulators and a combination of state regulations and local regulations, and having to do the same application, 3 times for 3 different people with different, slight formats, and some of the CEQA stuff. And the regulations are strangling the community, particularly the outdoor community. And so I think at this time, regulators could choose to ease back a little bit on the regulations as we look for sort of long-term sustainable changes in our regulatory system. And the third thing is tax relief. I know we didn't get our tax reduction this year. We have got to reduce taxes at the state level for this industry to be successful. And I think this moment with the pandemic, we could issue some sort of moratorium, perhaps a moratorium on the cultivation tax. I was happy to see that the increase on the cultivation tax didn't go forward, but it needs to be eliminated in the long term, and perhaps a short-term moratorium right now. So there's a lot we could do, Conrad.
Yeah. Wow, that was a lovely wish list. I would love to see that happen. That's great. And thank you for that personal story, right? Because what we're talking about is, it's not just abstract businesses, right? These are people doing the best they can, trying to run their businesses. And you're absolutely right. We've all experienced and seen and heard about the stories of trying to get through regulatory red tape and what it takes. And especially for the outdoor farmers, they deal with, especially on the environmental side, it is extremely difficult to get through all those processes at the local and state level. And CEQA, big deal. And, sadly, the cannabis industry is having to learn what CEQA means in California. And that's a big deal. Fiona, just to touch upon that piece, not the CEQA piece necessarily, but this tax piece, which is that we need tax relief. You're the treasurer. What do you think?
Right. So I sponsored Rob Bonta's bill that would reduce the excise tax from 15% to 11% and suspend the cultivation tax for 3 years. I sponsored it, in the last legislative session. I sponsored in this legislative session. Unfortunately, it got held up in committee. People feel like, well, we just passed Prop 64. Let's see what's going to happen. But clearly, the tax structure in Prop 64 was too high. And then when you add on all the local taxes that jurisdictions want to slap on, it could be 40% extra tax for those who are in the legal market and trying to do the right thing. And they're trying to compete against those that are not in the legal market. And so there's a big difference in prices. And that's the reason that we have this disparity here today. But I definitely agree with Patty. I think we need to do more in insurance. The funny thing about insurance, as I found out, is if you don't have a driver's license, you still need to have insurance if you want to drive a car. So the insurance industry has different latitudes than everybody else, and they just want to insure everybody. So, why can't we expand insurance, for the cannabis industry, just like everybody else, in case there is a loss due to, fire, flood, or any sort of business interruption. I also agree with streamlining, all the red tape that's out there. I know there's probably 5 agencies that are touching the cannabis industry right now. The governor's office did want to consolidate all of the processes into one agency, but then COVID hit. And so that initiative has been postponed until next year. But I think once you do that, then we can find some streamlining. You don't have to apply and submit the same paperwork and fee after fee, you know, to each agency. So I definitely agree with everything that everyone said. And, you know, we just have to continue to be vigilant, right? I learned everything I've learned because the industry was friendly to me. They wanted to take me on tours. They were very honest with me about their tax situation, how much they paid, how much they didn't, how you can get around paying taxes. And that to me was an eye opener. And you all need to also invite your legislators to join you, educate them, because when it goes through the legislature, these type of tax relief proposals, well, if people have no experience with cannabis, they're going to say, well, why are we going to give them a tax break, right? But all of you know the real situation, and you just need to help me educate them so that they become advocates for you, so these bills don't get stuck like in appropriations, for example.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do want to stick with you for just a second on a couple in terms of, you know, I want to get your perspective, but absolutely appreciate that we've got the Treasurer of California saying, yes, lower taxes on cannabis. Thank you for that. Believe me, we are going to be relying on you when the tax discussions come up. I think it's also critical to note that although it certainly was not what we ultimately wanted at the state level this year, the fact that we got a moratorium on an increase in the taxes was a big deal, in the fact that it was the first time we've gotten something that even looks like tax relief at the state level. So I like to believe that we've opened the door for further tax relief coming down the line. So back to that perspective real quick. One, I'm going to go a little higher level here. And I noticed that I think today or yesterday, ratings agencies, bond rating agencies, credit rating agencies downgraded the state of New York and the city of New York based on the effects of the pandemic and the recession. Curious if you have any perspective there on what might happen to California, because our credit rating was downgraded last time we had a recession. And
Right.
also does your perspective at the local level, what are you hearing from cities and counties in terms of their budget hits and budget shortfalls?
Right. A couple things. Number one is the state treasurer. I am the banker. And so every tax, fine, fee, interest, penalty comes into my agency, about $2.6 trillion every year. I also invest any idle funds that the state is not using, as well as invest for about 2,200 local government units. And then third, I also underwrite and all of the bonds that we issue here in the state through our state agencies, as well as the UCs and the CSUs. So last year, last fall, 2 of the 3 credit rating agencies actually upgraded us. This is pre-pandemic, but they upgraded us because of a number of reasons. Number one, we had a healthy rainy day fund, about $26 billion in our rainy day fund. Number two, an initiative we passed in 2010 now pretty much guarantees that the legislature is going to pass a balanced budget by June 30th, which is the end of our fiscal year. Partly because if we don't pass a balanced budget, every day we go over that date, legislators lose their pay permanently. And so all of a sudden that incentivizes everyone to come to the table and make that tough decision every fiscal year. And then I think those are the 2 main reasons. And during this pandemic, we did not see a downgrade from our credit rating agencies. We were the first ones back in the market in April out of all the states to sell bonds. We weren't really sure whether it was going to go well, but we were received very positively. I just sold bonds this past week that were oversubscribed. We got great rates. So people still have a lot of confidence in the state of California. They still want to invest in California bonds. We are still the 5th largest economy. And we all know that California has a diverse population. We are very entrepreneurial. We are creative. We are compassionate, but we are very, very hardworking. And as long as we can open back up, we are all going to get back to business very, very quickly and generate the revenues that we have lost. So everything still looks good for California. That's what I want to say.
Great, thank you. And just real quick, what have you heard at the local level? Like how
Oh.
bad is it going to get?
Yeah, so at the local level, we are still waiting. At the federal level, part of the $54 billion deficit that the governor signed off on in June 30th, 14 billion is contingent on stimulus money from the federal government. Hence, they're still fighting over it. If they could pass a package, I think we will get that 14 billion and we will stave off further cuts and furloughs, but that's what we're waiting on. And local governments also are waiting for what comes to the state, right? Trickles down to the local governments. But so far, everyone is still, I think, holding on. We're all waiting. Like I said, I manage funds for 22 local government units and none of them have pulled out the money. So to me, that says that, you know, everything is still, you know, still on hold, at least in the local government level.
Got it. That's great to hear. I mean, on the other hand, it's not great to hear that it's dependent on gridlock in Washington, D.C., but it's good to hear that there's a plan, at least, right?
Right.
I just want to point out that we're at nearly noon, and the next panel doesn't start until 12:15. But Treasurer Ma, I know that you are possibly having to jump off. So if you have any final statements or anything you'd like to say to us, or any asks.
Well, like I said, you know, keep being vigilant, keep advocating. We have a federal election on November 3rd. And for those of you who are following everything, whether it's the 280E, whether it's banking the industry, whether you want to open up, decriminalize, that is, a lot of it's going to be contingent on who gets elected on November 3rd to the White House and also the US Senate. So please make sure everybody votes.
That's right. Make sure you vote, people. Make a plan. Well, thank you very much. If you need to jump off.
Thank you. Okay.
You
We'll
bet.
see you soon. Thank you. Thank you, Hua.
And for the panel, the next panel doesn't start until 12:15, and we got a little bit of a late start. So if you don't mind, if you want to go just a little bit over 12, if that's possible, and if that works, just give me a thumbs up or a nod or something. Okay, great, wonderful. Well, look, we got some very important insight there from the treasurer, and I just want to kind of go off of this fact that kind of underneath and behind this entire year has been the upcoming election in November. And I don't want to make bets, but I do like to make predictions. So I'm curious to hear from the panel, a little bit what you think might happen at the federal level in terms of the White House, the Senate, and the House. But also curious as to what that means for legalization efforts, safe banking, any of those kind of pieces. Let's start out, Lynne.
Oh, wow. Really, we have to talk about the election. I'm trying to pretend it's not going to happen. So first of all, it's going to be a shit show. And I'm really glad it's going to happen right after harvest. I home grow, and at least I'm going to have all the weed I need at home. So that's first. Secondly, you know, in terms of once we actually know who the president is, which I think could take some time. I think if it's Donald Trump, then we will have more of the same, which is, you know, nothing, no real action whatsoever. If we have the same government with a Republican Senate and a Republican president. Unfortunately, I can't say it's going to for sure change if we have a President Joe Biden. It has been extremely disappointing to see that Joe Biden has not endorsed marijuana legalization as part of his platform. In fact, the Democratic Party hasn't adopted that as part of their platform. By the way, neither have they adopted Black Lives Matter. So we have a Democratic Party that is not in touch, I think, with its electorate. And so I think if Joe Biden wins, and I do think that's the likely scenario, although there will be election stealing going on. And so I don't know if he'll end up the president. I think he'll win. I don't know if he'll end up being the president. And I've been working presidential elections. My first one was 1992. But I think that if he does win and secure the presidency, we are going to have to put pressure on him unlike anything we've done before. because he's not there and he can be moved there. We saw that we were able to move Kamala Harris over the past 4 years. You know, in 2016, she was a no on legalization, and now she's a yes. So with her as the vice president, I think that that gives us more of a chance. But we can't take anything for granted. This isn't moving, I think, as fast as some people expected. And in some ways, I think what happens at the federal level could actually impact things in a negative way for localities. And so let me explain. When we saw Canada open their stock market to cannabis is when we saw the bubble in this market that has destroyed many businesses and many lives, and really, I think, took the feet out of our small and historical cannabis business owners. And so when we do finally deschedule, which we must at the federal level, we have to take note of what's going to happen when the big companies come in. Here in California, for example, I'm sure many of you know that Big Ag put hundreds of thousands and really millions of dollars into lobbying CDFA to create, to really violate Prop 64 and allow for stacking. And yet you haven't seen Big Ag go for any licenses. They are waiting. Big Ag, big tobacco, alcohol, pharma, et cetera, are all waiting until we have federal descheduling, and then they're going to jump in and blow every little farmer and dispensary owner and social equity owner out of the water. And so how can we inoculate our businesses against that when we get something we've been wanting at the federal level?
Yeah, wow. That's a lot there, but you're right, it's a lot to think about as well, because the truth is big alcohol, big tobacco, and big pharma are already here. They've already invested in companies, they've already built partnerships. They're not out and out taking over on the American side because of the Schedule 1 designation, but certainly they are making plans and making major investments. It's already happening. Thank you for that. Ellen.
Oh, gee. Well, my first presidential election was 1972. I worked. No, it's good to have young people like Lynne coming in here. As far as federal legalization, I have those concerns too about, other businesses jumping in. I mean, look how, Canada legalization changed things, even for the US. However, if California is able to sell to a national market, I think that could be very helpful for us. We could be Napa Valley of wine everywhere. As far as the presidential election, I mean, marijuana legalization is on the ballot in a few key states, and that may help bump things in the direction we need it to happen. Obviously, the Senate has been our big stumbling block on federal changes. And if that changes, that'll be big. I really encourage people. I've posted both a link to CalNORML's election guide, the Smoke the Vote guide, and a local action toolkit. Don't forget about local elections. They're extremely important, especially because a lot of local officials are the ones making decisions about whether or not to license and where and how they license and where and how it's being taxed. But also a lot of these local officials end up then running for state office and federal office. And it's something that, conservatives are really doing a lot better than liberals, I think, getting people elected even to school boards and planning commissions, very important. So get involved, check out our Smoke the Vote guide. And if you have information about local races where people are for or against cannabis, write in and let us know so that we can add it to the guide, and make sure that you vote.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Hirsh, I'll go to you next. And why don't we add in, I was going to do it on the next round, but add in kind of a recommendation for how people can get involved and stay engaged, and what they can do.
Yeah, I think Ellen and Lynne covered the federal dynamics really well. What I will just add, I think Ellen was mentioning all the state ballot initiatives. What I think is interesting about that is so many of those states border prohibition states, and we've seen that be really impactful. One of the reasons that Illinois was so impactful when it legalized cannabis is you have 5 or 6 states bordering it, which not only normalizes the activity, but then folks are driving in from Iowa, right, to get their cannabis. And so officials in Iowa say to themselves, why are we losing out on tax revenue? So, if New Jersey is often talked about and the impact it might have on New York and Pennsylvania, but also Montana, right? The impact that Montana might have on Wyoming, right? It might have on Idaho, that it might have on North Dakota and South Dakota. And so I think it would be really encouraging if all of those states legalized cannabis. And in terms of how folks can get involved, I go back to what we were talking about at the outset. I mean, particularly in California, as so many of these cities are ready to begin embracing cannabis, I think there needs to be folks on the ground that describe what an ordinance looks like that enables broad participation in the market, right? That doesn't have limited licenses, that doesn't require that you have 3 lawyers to get a license, that doesn't require that you have a property for a year. And so I think pushing for those ordinances would be helpful. And I'll just say, from the perspective of, South Asian immigrants, for instance, right? When they moved here, the ways that they built wealth was owning gas stations, right? And owning liquor stores. And so if we can do that, then we can help realize the generational wealth that we often talk about when it comes to ownership in the cannabis industry, if we just let more people participate in this economy.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great kind of story, right? About wealth building for immigrants, and the critical piece of it. And frankly, that it is the cornerstone of the American dream, right? Is that you can have a little piece and build off of it. Lynne, just to get your recommendations to folks on how to get involved, how to engage.
Well, I see that Ellen posted the guide to the election on the CalNORML site, and I think it's great to have guides like that. And so make sure we take a look at that. I think if you live in one of these cities, that's where your vote really matters. And I see Lily Balfour posted in the chat about San Anselmo. One of the cities that actually happened to go and speak to the council there. And yeah, the level of NIMBYism and the level of misinformation that some of those folks were spreading is incredibly problematic. So I think that, having people who aren't necessarily trying to get the licenses, but are part of the cannabis industry speaking up really goes a long way. So it doesn't feel like only those who are self-interested or financially interested are getting in. And then the second thing I'd like to say about this election, which has nothing to do with cannabis, but it has to do with all of us as white people. And many of us on this call are white people. And as President Trump gets ready to send his, Trump's army in to watch the polls, this is really about intimidating Black and brown people. And so those of us who are at those polls and see that happen have got to stand up and say something. And so I think, I see my role in this next election in being a counter poll watcher and just making sure that Black folks and immigrants are not being, threatened and abused by some of these people. So that's what I see as a key role for us white folks in this next election.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. That is to be honest, it scares me a little bit that's where voting is at in this country right now. And I hope and pray that it actually doesn't come down to, melees erupting at voting places, because that is the cornerstone of our democracy. And we should all remember, voting is what gave birth to our industry, period, right? So the cannabis industry as a whole should always be supporting the right to vote and the ability of people to vote privately and how they need to, and without fear. It is absolutely critical. Folks, I think we're about at the end of our time here, so I'd like to wrap it up. Again, just to reiterate some of our points here, stay engaged at the local level, get to know your local city council, your local supervisors, and keep fighting and keep pushing, and make sure you have a plan to vote for this November. I would just add, on a personal level, make sure to take care of yourself, take care of those around you, and be kind, right? It's a crazy year. But with that, thank you everyone so much. It's a great panel.